because it is one of the craziest things that has happened in my ministry to date.
Amen. I just hope some Krav Maga made it. Oh, no, maybe not. I don't.
No. Welcome back to Reason Together, the podcast for Christians who think about stuff. I'm Thomas, here with Daniel for another episode.
Yeah, great to be back.
Yeah, how have you been?
Busy, pretty good. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Me too. That seems to be the name of the game these days.
Yeah, I don't know how long it's been in the English vocabulary when crazy became like an adverb, or let's see, maybe it'd be like a double. I don't know. What do you call like what modifies an adjective?
You're asking the wrong guy.
Okay, like in grammar, because now it's not we're busy, it's crazy busy. Instead of that's just crazy, it's like crazy busy, or stupid busy. You know, when that you didn't used to use those two together, but I think that's becoming. Oh, I don't know. It makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Anyway, but patrons, we want to take this chance before we jump into our conversation to thank you so much for your supportment. Oh my God. Yes.
Daniel just makes up words.
That's right. Here on the podcast where we make it up as we go. If there's not a word for it, we'll make one. All right. So thank you for all of your supportment, whatever that might mean, and for your support and prayers and listening and sharing, and just I really do appreciate that. And if you're interested in being a patron, go to patreon.com/reasontogether. We'd like to hear from our listeners and have more here as we've had more tenure. Is that the word? As we've had more history as a podcast. We've started to get more feedback, I think. And if you've got a question, maybe it's something we've never discussed, totally fine. You say, oh, this is going to sound like a weird question. Well, maybe it will, but shoot it our way anyway. It's reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com. That's all together, reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com. We'd like to hear what you say, questions that you have, even comments about what we've already talked about. We'd love to hear from you.
Very good. In the last episode, we talked about the image of God. Do you remember that? From
no,
a week ago.
Are you kidding? That is honestly one of my fears about this podcast is somebody coming up to me going, "Oh man, and actually they have like, yeah, what you said on that podcast," and I don't even remember that conversation. What did I say? If somebody says, "Well, you said this," I'd have to go back to listen to the podcast to see if I did. I mean, maybe there'd be some I'd be, no, I didn't. I surely didn't say that.
Yeah,
but, to remember everything we've ever said.
Well, it's weird. I used to think sometimes. Maybe be a little silently judgy of people who couldn't remember what was preached on after the sermon was over. And then it wasn't long ago, I had an experience where someone asked me, "So what'd you preach on today?" And I was like,
today.
I don't know.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
I go a little easier now, I guess.
Yeah. Once it's true of us, then we ease up on other people.
That's right. That is the standard, isn't it?
It is. All right. What was your original question?
I was saying how in the last episode we introduced a subject that I guess some people debate. I guess I still can't figure out why. Like, what's the image implication?
Of God. Okay. Now I do remember
the image of God thing.
Right. Mm-hmm,
so is mankind still made in God's image, or did he lose God's image at the fall? And I got some feedback from a listener on this.
Okay.
And of course, the context was that I was talking with a man who took this position that we no longer are made in God's image after the fall.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And
I remember you mentioning that.
Yeah, I ended up writing him a letter, an email, just to kind of explain at least somewhat of my view on the subject. It certainly wasn't exhaustive, but it was at least several things for him to consider. And then I got some feedback a few days after that from one of our listeners who brought in a very good point. And it was basically this. This is from Michael. This was from the patron message board.
Okay.
He says, in the debate about whether or not we are created in the image of God, of course, I believe that we are, a question could be brought up. If we aren't created in the image of God, then why is murder such an offense to God?
Yeah.
And he references, and I wish I had thought of this, because I think this kind of puts the argument to bed.
Uh-huh.
He references Genesis 9:6. The context here is that Noah and his family are off the ark by this point. The flood waters have abated, and the Lord institutes, we might say, the very first form of human government here, outside of
Right.
sort of family government. And it says there, whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for him in the image of God made he man.
Oh, man, that's great.
Now, interestingly, even though it says he made man in the image of God, that is past tense, someone could argue, oh, well, that's past tense. He made him at first in the image of God. But that the point is not the past tense here of the phrase made he man. The point is murder was punishable by death right then in Genesis 9:6.
Right, which is
And the
hundreds of
reason
years
for
into
it,
human history.
right, and the reason for it is man is made in God's image.
Right. Yep.
Right then. If
Okay.
man was no longer made in God's image, then really this statement makes no sense.
Okay. Honestly, years ago, we've been podcasting now about 5 years, and I think within our first year, we extended a verbal award to a listener named Sarah. And that award was, I wish I'd have thought of that first award, I think. And so, Michael, I just want to bestow upon you the second of these awards. I
Yes.
wish I'd have thought of that first.
We need some sort of like celebratory sound, like, and then
Nice.
we can
Well done.
officially declare
There you go.
the award given to Michael Larson for thinking of it first.
Yes. Yes, very good. Thank you, Michael. That was a great point there.
But in the letter that I did write to the man, in many ways, it was kind of formulating some of my thoughts on the issue, or solidifying, I should say, some of my thoughts on the issue. I was trying to see the relationship between consciousness or sentience in man and the image of God and the authority that is delegated to man in Scripture. And basically, I think the man was confused, thinking that what mankind lost at the fall was the image of God, but what he lost was his innocence. And he was conflating those two things. And I think there's a sufficient body of evidence to be able to say those are two different things.
Well, sure.
In James 3:9, it says, therewith bless we God, even the Father, and therewith curse we man, speaking about the tongue, which are made after the similitude of God. And though that's a different word, the point James is making is that you have to be careful what you say to other people and about other people, because they're made in the image of God, same as you. So I think there's sufficient evidence to say that, yes, we are still made in the image of God today. Sure. We did not lose that at the fall. We lost our innocence. But I'm still struggling to see what the implications of the argument are. Anyway, probably something for a different day.
Well, yeah, maybe. I mean, the one thing I think, well, if they think, I would say that, obviously that something changed at the fall, maybe more than we lost our innocence, but his image in us was marred or something like that, so that we're being restored to the image of Christ as we submit to the Holy Spirit. We're being transformed back into something. But right. What was I going to say?
I think you got it, or
no, I don't. Go ahead and keep talking, okay, so then I can sound more intelligent when I come out with it later.
Okay, because that's what we're after
right now. Like,
yeah. But the relationship between dominion and authority, or the relationship between dominion and the image of God became more prevalent as I continued to study this after our last episode
Okay.
because it literally comes right from the text in Genesis 1:26 that they said, "Let us make man in our image and likeness, and after our likeness, and let them have dominion."
Yes. Uh-huh.
So it's literally right in the context of it,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
the dominion principle. So
Mm-hmm.
whatever the image of God is, it is connected vitally to the concept of dominion. And it's referenced for us again in 1 Corinthians 11:7. Even though man has been given dominion over the earth, right,
Mm-hmm.
by having the image of God, the image of God is then cited to refer to man's dominion in the home in
Hmm.
1 Corinthians 11:7. So authority is very much connected to the idea of the image of God.
Mm-hmm.
So if you say that even the image of God was marred at the fall, I'm not even sure we can say that
Mm-hmm.
because mankind still has dominion over the earth. We still are able to subdue the animal kingdom. We're still able to invent and create and harvest and plant and all these things and exercise dominion over the earth in many ways better than they did in the ancient world. So mankind still has dominion because he has the image of God, because he is conscious and sentient and can think and invent and create. So yeah, I wouldn't even say that the image of God was marred per se at the fall. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I guess I'm just trying to balance it to some degree with the passages where maybe this isn't the best one, but Colossians, 3:10, and have put on the new man, which is renewed in knowledge after the image of him that created him. Talking about how, um, you know, Christ's image and us, and like how are we restored somehow to that image if we always had it? You know what I mean?
Right.
So maybe
Good
that's
point.
not good use of terminology there, but anyway, and maybe
What
that's
was that? What was that passage again? Colossians.
Colossians 3:10, and there may be others
Okay.
that kind of deal with the image in the New Testament.
Mhm.
Um,
So you think then
so
there's justification to say that the image of God was in some way marred in man, but that we still are made in his image now.
yes, now I don't know. Maybe marred's not the right word, but yeah, it just sometimes you really do have to find the right word to encapsulate exactly what you mean to say, and marred may
Yeah.
not really be that one. But
Okay.
um,
All right.
so, like, okay, Romans 8:29, for whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his son. Okay, well, is that like once we're glorified, we're conformed to the image of his son, or is that the sanctification process?
See, again,
Um,
yeah, I think that's related to sanctification. There's a moral question surrounding the image of God in that verse. Whereas I think the image of God that we get from Genesis 1:26 and Genesis 9:6, that is an authority
mhm, mhm.
relationship to that phrase, the image of God. So there is, in a sense, two ways that the phrase is being used, one referring to the moral nature of man, the other referring to the dominion nature of man,
Hmm.
because he is a sentient and conscious being.
And maybe that's the distinction where that helps that balance there. So,
Yeah.
okay. Um,
I don't know
well,
what to do with all that information or how it will
yeah,
actually
you're still looking for the
affect anything.
yeah. Oh, well, I guess what I was going to say earlier was that if someone says, well, they sinned, they lost their innocence, but they're still in the image of God, it somehow impugns the nature of God. How could you be in the image of God and be a sinner? You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
and
That
see
just it
that
sounds wrong. The optic is bad.
right. I think that is somewhat of a reification there. There is kind of a conflation of two things that aren't related
Yeah,
in a
I know what you
sense.
mean.
Man can lose the image of God that he was made with, and become a sinner and still be. Let me rephrase that. Man can lose his innocence, become a sinner, but still be made in the image of God
Hmm.
without that impugning God.
Yeah, I think that may be
Did
fair
we
enough.
get did we get
We're pretty
it?
close. Yeah,
Okay.
we'll leave it there.
All right. Let's leave it there.
We also have, it looks like, feedback regarding you asked the question last time regarding a call to, say someone expresses a desire to, uh, I want to be a pastor, right? I
Hmm.
think that was your question. And then
Yeah.
versus someone saying, I'd like to be a deacon. why do we respond differently? Do we respond differently to those things? And Nathan writes in and says, in the discussion surrounding Tom's question about how to respond to someone who wants to be a pastor, it may be helpful to note, and forgive me if you did so in this episode and I missed it, 1 Timothy 3:1, if a man desire the office of a bishop, he desireth a good work. This seems to be a pretty clear statement that the desire to be a pastor is a good thing. However, I do have a question. It seemed that you both made it clear in your discussion that you would immediately take into consideration the qualifications of the person who desires to be a pastor with good reason. I assume that this is because you would not encourage an obviously disqualified person to pursue pastoring. But in many cases, it seems that this desire is often expressed by a young person who may or may not be qualified as of yet, but who senses a desire in their own heart to pursue a ministry path. A teenager who believes God is calling him into ministry most likely is not qualified to pastor, husband of one wife, ruling his house well, etc. So would you encourage that young person to pursue serving the Lord in that way? And if so, how would you direct them to prepare to be a pastor? Okay.
I feel like in some ways Nathan maybe is taking a different tack with the question than I had intended, and that's
Right.
not Nathan's fault. It's more likely related to perhaps my tendency to be somewhat of an obfuscator of what's happening in my mind at the moment.
Or just the
Does,
direction our conversation took, but your original question brought into play the deacon desire.
right. It was
Yeah.
more about the deacon really than it was about the pastor, because kind of the way that we often think is, and it's based on 1 Timothy 3, if a man desire the office of a bishop. I can't remember if I referenced it. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't, but it certainly was on my mind in the question. That's why maybe I
Likewise.
just presumed it, is that we don't think it's abnormal for someone to desire the office of a pastor. In fact, we would sometimes encourage a qualified person, especially, or even someone who is, what's the word? Qualified in potentia, we might say, a young person. We even encourage the idea of desiring the office of a pastor. But when someone comes and says, I would like to be a deacon, we often inwardly cringe, go, oh, what's this guy want? Does he want the preeminence in the church? It's we get a little cringy about it. And what we concluded was that the reason we feel that way is basically because of the way that the offices are chosen. One is called by God, who imports a desire into a person's heart for the office, whereas the other, historically from Acts chapter 7, were sought out and selected by the church. Mm-hmm. So it seems odd to us when someone who is, desiring the latter office comes and says, I would like to be a deacon. It's typically because that person is typically chosen. But yeah, that was kind of the nature of the question. But, Nathan does take it in an interesting direction here, which I wouldn't mind fleshing out here.
No,
because
go ahead,
he does say, it seemed both of you made clear in your discussion. Maybe it's the only thing we made clear. I don't know. That's me adding my words there. It seemed that you both made it clear in your discussion that you would immediately take into consideration the qualifications of the person who desires to be a pastor with good reason. But he says in many cases, it seems that this desire is often expressed by a young person who may or may not be qualified as of yet, but who senses a desire in their own heart to pursue a ministry path. So he says a teenager who believes God is calling him into ministry most likely is not qualified to pastor. And he references here the husband of one wife, ruling his house well, etc. So would we encourage such a person to pursue serving the Lord as a pastor? And I say, why not? That's what I meant by a moment ago when I said qualified in potentia. The idea is honestly that we would want to encourage all young men to not only become qualified, but remain qualified. Even if they don't sense a desire at the moment for the office of pastor, someday they might. Someday they might. Mm-hmm. That's kind of what I would say is to stay qualified.
I guess I would probably say I would encourage a young person, but to go to the next question, how would you direct them to prepare?
Mm.
I would probably say I would encourage, but I can't say I would promote, because
Yes.
you don't want to make too big of an issue of it, where you promote a novice, and
Hmm.
you create in him this feeling that, oh, I'm raising you to a status of you've been called, and now everyone looks at you
Hmm.
differently. I'd say, look, if you're serious about this, then there's a few things that you'll really want to hone in on. If you feel like this is your life's calling and this is how God intends to use you, I mean, this is serious. And so one thing, let's start learning how to study,
Yeah.
because this is the core and the huge part of what you do is being able to communicate what God actually said. So let's
Yeah.
learn how to study, and then let's get maybe some opportunities to preach, not so much to, again, to promote you, but because it's going to be a process to learn to communicate
Yeah.
publicly in an articulate
And
way with
sure.
confidence.
And maybe I'm being a little bit pedantic, but because this is maybe, kind of a similar way of saying the same thing, but
Hmm.
rather than telling someone learn how to study, which can seem like a very overwhelming task, it
Hmm.
sounds very, very serious and overwhelming. I would encourage a young person, learn how to explain the Bible to yourself
Hmm.
or to someone else. Learn how to explain it. Now, implicit in that is, if you're going to do that, you have to study it.
Hmm.
But in a sense, we're simplifying the process of study to its objective, which is to learn to explain it. So essentially, we are simply boiling down the the idea of learning to study into its objective, which is you're learning to explain the Bible. Now, what that will force a young person to do is to study it so that they can explain it in terms that they understand. You have to be able to teach it to yourself first if you're going to teach it to anybody else. Um,
Yeah, and that's a good point. But I probably then would even say, hey, let's start meeting on a, as regular a basis as possible
mhm.
to talk about how to study. I mean, in order for you to explain it to yourself, we need to know how to compare scripture to scripture. We need to know how to actually analyze the text,
Right,
understand the grammar of it, so that it's not just, well, this says to me that, or just all the typical
right.
flaws or whatever, and just say, no, no, we really need to know how to explain it to yourself in a way that's valid. But yes,
Yeah,
that's a good way to put it. How to explain it to yourself.
sure. Well, there's an interesting side application there, to what you said with getting together with them to study. Is that in a sense it does make the a call evident in some way if someone is willing to do that,
Yeah.
and it'll make it apparent to you, the if you're discipling them in that, whether or not they really are gifted in the way that someone who is called would be. And the reason I say this is because there is somewhat of a personal story here. If you remember, and you'll have to think back to, this would have been 2009.
Okay.
Um, I came to you and Pastor Dietrich about going into the ministry. And one of the things, in addition to many other things, that Pastor Dietrich had said was, well, start meeting with us to study once a week.
Hmm.
But at the same time, there was another man, a young man in the church, who suspected he might be called to preach. And we started meeting, and I think he was there for one Thursday. I think it was what it was, and never came back again. And in many ways, it made it evident, um, perhaps, that he wasn't really called to do that. Does that
Mm.
make sense?
Sure. Hmm.
So yeah, I think what you're saying is good there, to encourage a young person to get together and study if they sense a call to preach.
Right, because you think about the text itself, says, if a man desire the office of a bishop, he desireth a good work. There is a work to it.
Hmm.
It's not just an office; it's a work.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so he might like the office, but does he truly? You tell him, this is work, but it is a very desirable work. And if God
yeah.
calls you to it, this is, tremendous.
Yeah, and I've harped on this one a lot too. If a young person senses a call to preach, um, I would also encourage them to develop a skill,
Hmm.
especially depending on where they're called to, or where they if they already have some sense of where they might be called to.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of a full-time vocational pastor is becoming less and less common.
Mm.
Churches are getting smaller in some parts of the country. Maybe if the kid said, I feel like, I'm called to, pastor, down south or somewhere or some parts of middle America, the idea of becoming a full-time vocational pastor there may be a little more realistic, even in some senses where, like in the South, one of the biggest things they complain about there is that there's largely an unregenerate church membership in some places
Mm-hmm.
where people just kind of go because it's their Southern heritage to go to church.
Mm-hmm.
And they might not be saved people, but in the South, you'll often always have people in a lot of places. Not everywhere, but in a lot of places down south, you will. Whereas up in the Northeast and out on the West Coast, it's becoming less common to have, bigger churches that are doing things right. So developing a skill alongside that, I think, would be valuable for
Yeah.
a young person.
I just this morning, I was kind of surveying, I kind of went through Titus, kind of in quick fashion, and just kind of scanning Titus and noticing what what he was supposed to do. And it seemed like almost everything, if not everything, was, exhort them this, exhort them that, teach them this. And even I think it was at chapter 1 where he is supposed to be able to, convince the gainsayers. So to me, there's a real work of study that has to
Mm-hmm.
just be core to what the pastor is. He
Yeah.
has to understand how to approach the issues of life with, with a meaningful understanding of Scripture.
Yeah.
But then it was interesting that I think about 4 times, maybe more, he mentions good works. Be ready
Mm-hmm.
to good works, and then he finishes the next to the last verse in the book. He says, "And let ours also." It seems like, and let us who are Christians also
Yeah.
learn to maintain good works for necessary uses, that they be not unfruitful. So it's kind of like when, there's certain things you need to know how to do for when it's necessary. And
Yeah.
I could
What's
see
that
that,
reference?
Titus 3:14. And I could see where the skill would come in play there, even for Paul, that obviously he was a man on a mission, and he so was pursuing Christ, and yet there was tent making in the process because that
Sure.
was necessary at the time. The Philippians offered, others may at times have supported him financially. He knew how to abound, he knew how to be abased, but when it was necessary, he had a skill that he could use, and I don't think
Yeah.
that's unwarranted. But still,
Right.
weighing that over with the fact that you need to be well studied. This kind of
Right.
leads me into the next question, or
What
do you have another thought?
Well, I was going to ask you, what
Yeah.
about also the encouraging them in some way in the study of like logic and rhetoric?
Hmm.
Just being able to understand how to make an argument
Hmm.
and how to destroy one.
Yes, I think that done by a spiritual man would be a
Hmm.
wise idea. Rhetoric is so powerful, and logic to some degree too, because it's like being in a business meeting where Robert's Rules of Order, and you
Hmm.
can like twist and turn that thing if they don't know what they're doing, because the rules and you know how to do all this and that. You can use it uh, to a bad end. You know what I mean? Well, a
Right.
similar thing with logic and rhetoric, that you can so craft a statement and a sentence and demolish people's thinking and all that, and say, well, in the end, I don't know if that's really useful. And I've seen, I can think of a YouTuber, a certain apologist, he would consider himself, and I'm sure he's intelligent and studied and things like that. But I just sort of get this air from him that he loves kind of what he knows. He loves being able to just
Hmm.
tear people up or whatever, you know what I mean? To just have that comment to just beat him. And I just think, oh, I hate that. That attitude. You want to know what you believe, why you believe it. You want to be able to stand confidently and yet really, come across in the right way. Yes, be articulate, but care for people at the same time. So yeah, I definitely think that logic, because you don't want to undermine your whole cause by sounding stupid, by not knowing how to verbalize what you're
Right.
saying, by not knowing how to counter an argument, by not knowing how to even craft a thought, how to put
Right.
together a logical, valid thought. But yeah, it has to be done with that balanced view of, now use this use this in the right way.
Right.
That brings me to a question. I told you a while back, or a little while back, that I had I was doing a lot of driving. I was on the road a lot, back and forth from another state, and I had an opportunity to just listen to a number of podcasts one day, and it was enjoyable, and yet it's like, well, then it really gets the mind going, like, oh, in these different thoughts. And what was getting my mind going in part was I was listening to, I guess you would call it, political podcast, and it was after the. Do you remember the old show Hannity and Combs? Did you ever hear
I've
of that
heard of it.
show? Okay.
I did not watch it. No, I don't really know anything
Yeah, I think
about
I
it.
might have known it in the tail end. Not that I really ever watched it hardly, but Hannity was the conservative, Combs was the liberal, whatever, and so they would probably talk about the news from two different angles, but they were both hosts of the show. Well, this was a podcast that actually was the same thing, where one's the conservative, one's the liberal, and they'll interview somebody or whatever, but they're both coming at it from different angles, obviously, different. Aspects politically. And they were interviewing a well-known, I guess, liberal attorney. And I was just, it was interesting to hear the man that you had to in some ways appreciate. I think there's something to a good attorney's mind that he recognizes the value of facts.
Mm-hmm.
He needs evidence, right? And so in some ways, I guess it brought home to me that, we as believers, and really in anything that we believe and want to convince people of, we need to know the facts, not just our conclusions.
Sure.
We know what we believe about it, but why? What has brought us to that belief? And if we don't really know what's brought us to that belief, then we really don't stand on very solid ground. Well, that's what I've always heard. Well, that's not a good argument at all. So why do you believe the things that you believe? Go back and be able to cite the facts, build the case, state the evidence, and know those things. Because for somebody who thinks like that, who says, well, what's your evidence? What's your evidence on that? Now, they were talking politically, and believe it or not, he was a friend of Hillary Clinton and thought Hillary was, a genuinely kind and genteel person, and blah, 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 blah. And we go, oh my goodness, you know what I mean? But he's saying, what's your evidence against Hillary, right? Something like that. Well, if we've just been listening to talk radio and we've just kind of, yeah, that's right, yeah, but we haven't really absorbed enough of it to ever really restate it. We just go, yeah, we don't like her,
Mm.
Well, you don't have a good argument then. I mean, he says, okay, so what argument do you actually have against? Well, I know she's done some bad stuff. Like what? Well, I don't know. There's been a bunch of things. Like what? Actually be able to state something, build your case. Of course, I'm
Well,
not.
frankly, if someone's willing to call me a deplorable just because I don't enable their political desires, then
That would be
I
a
wouldn't
strike
call
one.
them a nice person.
Yeah. Well, see, there you go. But you actually have, so what you're doing is you're stating a speech that she made that maybe she didn't realize was being recorded, and so, yeah, you could actually cite that as a thing. But so the idea, know the facts, not just your conclusion. And then, and so one of the takeaways, you need to be prepared, and that's going to require study. It's going to require not just listening to people that you agree with, but trying to log, okay, what are they saying? What's the case they're building? What are they citing? Now, I know as I listen to political podcasts, I enjoy that at times. Sometimes I tire of it, but other
Mm-hmm.
times I just really enjoy hearing about it. And these guys immerse themselves in it all the time, and that's their job. They are reading news articles, they're examining this, they're doing this, they're commenting on it, so they can call names and cases and this person, this what went on 10 years ago, because that's their life. Well, my life is Bible, and so I ought to be prepared when someone asks me a question of biblical relevance, or asks me well, what about this? Or what do you believe about this? Well, what would God say about this? Well, what can I do about my marriage? Well, what about this social thing over here? What does the Bible have to say about that? I should be studied. And of course, I'm not going to know all the answers right now, but I should be heading in that direction, to not just
Yeah.
say, well, that's bad. That's bad. Well, why is it bad? What should we do about it? What does God have to say about it? So anyway, the need to be prepared. But then I was sort of irritated, and I guess it's still, you're dealing with a sinner, that the lawyer was still using lawyer tactics. While I could appreciate in one way, he wants evidence. And I think he at times acknowledged, okay, that's a good point. On the other
Mm-hmm.
hand, I could see a little bit of lawyerishness in there, and that kind of goes to that rhetoric thing. That if
Yeah.
I can use a certain strategy, a certain technique on you, that you say something and boom, I grab onto that word and then I begin to badger you about that word, instead of in honesty, what do they call it? Good faith. Say,
Mm-hmm.
go ahead, keep talking. Make your argument. I could
So,
pick apart what you said, but what I want to hear is actually what you believe, so that we can talk about the substance of the issue. But if I'm going to win the case, I'm going to badger you and make you look stupid right here with the time that we have, and boom, I've won. Well,
so
to me,
is that the thing that you were calling a lawyerish
yes,
type
a
behavior?
lawyer's type. You're right, because it's not really seeking to get to the truth. Let's actually talk about the facts. Okay, so maybe the other guy that you're talking to isn't super smooth and know all the facts, but let him try to make his case, and then at least let him, whatever, let him say something. Or if somebody's trying to badger me, oh yeah, what about that, oh, the little soundbite, oh yeah, what about this? Say, no, okay, listen, you know what I'm trying to say. So to me, at the foundation, you still want, I don't want somebody to be disingenuous. If you're really looking for truth, don't look for distraction or misrepresentation or accusation, that impugns your character. Like the one guy said, well, you're good at adjectives, you know how to describe things, but you don't know how to give me evidence. You're good at calling people things. Okay. But
Hmm.
do we really have time to flesh out the argument? And then one other thing I had, when someone is confronted with truth, but in pride he elevates himself and attempts to justify his position, I think it deserves the judgment he gets. When you actually confront them with truth, and then they're willing to walk away for whatever reasons, of course they're worthy of judgment, and we don't necessarily always recognize that. But anyway, that's just some takeaways from that. Not that I have a question from that, but you had said, well, write down your thoughts on that, and kind of going to, it's being impressed on me, and I guess just reaffirmed in me. For me personally, if I'm going to be a pastor, I really feel like so much of that is know the word,
Mm-hmm.
be an apologist. Though many quote unquote apologists know how to make an apologetic for God, but not much beyond that sometimes.
Sure. Yeah.
They can prove God, but they're not a Baptist. Well, I feel like, well, I'm a Baptist because I believe that I ought to be a Baptist, and because that's biblical. Well, then I need to know and make the case for, or we listen, you and I listen to folks that we say, man, I really like their political position, or wow, they state that really well, but they're Roman Catholics.
Mm-hmm.
Well, with the same degree of preparedness that they can talk politics, and believe it or not, that to some degree they can even talk about their faith, I need to be able to talk about my faith and rebut what they're saying and show the
Yeah.
substance of why I truly stand where I'm at, especially since that's what I'm supposed to be, right? As a pastor. I mean,
Right.
that's your job. You're a man of the cloth, and you don't know how to defend what you believe. I really need to know. I mean, we need to be studying.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm pretty sure I know who you're referring to with the political podcasts that we listen to. And I have heard some of their arguments for why they are Roman Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
And what strikes me the most frustrating about that is because it seems that even the most intelligent, well-read, studied minds can still make bad arguments
Yeah.
when they simply don't want to change their conclusion. And, I've heard them make arguments for Roman Catholicism. And frankly, their arguments are disingenuous. I've heard them make arguments for Judaism, and their arguments are frankly disingenuous. And it's like you get frustrated because you're like, your entire life is taking politics and finding the evidence, stating arguments, and debunking wrong claims. And it's like, you can't even do that with yourself on this issue,
Mm-hmm.
because it's like, and that's why I say disingenuous is the word that keeps coming to mind, because it's that one area, in the sense they've already chosen where they want to fall on the issue. So now their arguments then have to fall in line with their conclusion first. And that's backwards.
Yeah, right, right. But have you ever thought about, what if I got onto a plane? What if I was traveling and I saw this guy in an airport, and I had 20 minutes to talk to him? Would I be able to make my case?
Mm-hmm.
To someone that intelligent? Would I be able to um, in good humor and with good people skills, but do I actually have the substance ready at hand to make a really good solid case and be that light of truth to someone, to say, look, I've given you something, you can walk away from it, but you can't deny that this is a solid case. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Or would I just go, or repeat a few
Right.
verses and not be able to string together? And
arguably not everyone is going to be able to do that. I think different personalities play into that as well. I know
well,
folks that no
yeah,
matter how intelligent they are, no matter how well reasoned they are, or articulate they are,
mm-hmm.
if it's in the pressure of a debate,
Oh yeah,
or
oh right.
even a gentle debate, I'm not talking about a heated one, even under the pressure of a debate that involves confronting someone who disagrees with you, they shut down. And I can't necessarily fault every personality type for that. Some people just aren't wired that way.
No, I do understand that. I just, and I would just say that generally as Christians, we ought to be studying, we ought to be growing, but especially for those who are called to feed the flock and to make an apologetic and
Yeah.
to, whatever Titus says, convince the gainsayers.
Yeah.
We've got a job. We've got some studying we got to do for sure,
Yeah.
and set an example.
So
Um,
would you go as far as to say that if someone doesn't seem to have the ability to do that, um, that they might really question whether or not their call is genuine?
yes. Now,
Okay.
now to now that's going to sound harsh right at first. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, I think there's going to be gradations of that.
Sure.
Because personally, as I'm being honest about myself, I go, whoa, I need a lot of work in this area. I may be growing, but I have so much more I want to do. So who is ever exactly where they want to be? You have some, who just aren't, and I don't mean this mean, but they just aren't as mentally acute, say,
Yeah.
you know, but they still can be solid in what they say. They may not know how
Sure.
to go 7 steps down, and they may not know how to get all philosophical on it, but they can still be solid. And if they're constantly expounding truth, they ought to be growing in some way. And if you just sort of feel like nothing that comes out of my mouth is a tremendous amount of substance, well, then you kind of have to look at the guy's pulpit ministry and say, well, if there's not a whole lot of substance there, he's either, you can maybe start to question his call, or his how seriously he takes his call.
Right.
He might just be in this place where the people are happy. Oh, preacher, you this and that. And he's happy. And as long as the church just kind of keeps going week to week and everybody's happy and they're sort of okay with the message and it's what they've always heard before, and he's a likable guy and he's got enough humor in his message that we're all happy. Well, that doesn't mean he's
Hmm.
being the pastor that he ought to be.
Right. Right.
And so,
So there should be some sort of demonstrable ability to make an argument and even destroy one, or at least the potential to learn it.
well, to some degree, yes, because what doesn't it say apt to teach? That means you
Yes.
can communicate truth in a
Mhm.
way that's helpful. You know what I mean? That
Yeah.
doesn't just that's discernible.
Right.
So yeah, interesting. It's a side note too. People's softness. I just in our culture, we talk about it and we hear about it, how fragile the younger generation is about their beliefs. Well, I just got a piece of that today. We sent out a couple times a year. We've now for about 10 years been sending out a newspaper out of our church. We write the
Mhm.
articles. I format it. We have it printed, and then we send it. and now, praise the Lord, we're at the point where we can send it to just about every household in a 20-mile radius. So it's getting in their mailbox. They have the opportunity to read it. You have some name exposure there, but you're putting oftentimes the gospel, but other obviously substantive articles. We may have 5, 6, maybe 7 articles per. It's just an 8-page newspaper. But anyway, so we got a phone call, somebody saying that they were calling to see. Now, to her credit, she was calm on the answering machine, but she wanted to see if there was a way that she could be taken off of our list, because she didn't agree with us, and she didn't like us trying to force her to believe like we do.
Force her.
That was the word, force her. It's a newspaper, and yet we're forcing her because
Wow.
we put a newspaper in the mailbox. Isn't that amazing?
People need to use a dictionary more. Force her.
Yeah, and I mean, the bad news is for her that no, actually, I can't take you off the list because of the way that we send it. It literally just blankets the entire community, basically, or the whole mailing route.
What was her response?
Well, she didn't leave a callback number, but she said she will call back. But the answer is, well, I'm sorry you disagree, and unfortunately, I can't take you off the list. But you're certainly free to throw it in the trash can. You're not going to offend me. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
if you,
sure.
we sort of anticipate that happening. That if you don't agree and you vehemently deny what we say, then just pitch it. You know what I mean? It's that easy. But anyway, people being triggered. So.
I have a story. I actually started this story in the last episode as we went into the after show, and we took it into the after show. But speaking of triggered and kind of people's fragile constitution, I have an update to the story.
Okay. But we're going to have to cover that on the other side of the wall.
We're going to have to take that to the after show because it is one of the craziest things that has happened in my ministry to date.
Amen. I just hope some Krav Maga made. Oh no, maybe not. I don't.
No. Though it. I will say, I was prepared in case it did. I was prepared, and I thought it might.
You were thinking,
but yeah.
All right. Well, hey, thanks for joining us. And we didn't have maybe so many questions this time as feedback and thoughts. And so I hope it didn't bore you. But if you've got any thoughts of your own or some commentary on what you heard from us about being prepared, about being triggered, about desire for the ministry, whatever it may be, hey, just fire it our way, reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com.
Thank you again for being with us on this episode. We are encouraging balance, developing perspective, and connecting faith to practice. This is Reason Together.